Boker Tov, everybody. Really, as I say, a special pleasure, even though to hear, of course, the Toronto Eruv, something near and dear to my heart, the history of Toronto Eruv, which you'll probably hear had a controversial history, I guess, at a certain point. But really, Baruch Hashem, I can walk the streets in Toronto carrying because of we're after St. Louis, one of the early Eruv in North America. So we'll hear that in a moment. I just want to thank Susan and Barry Lieberman for their sponsorship of this whole series and appreciation for Torah Motion. And also today's day of learning across all platforms in Torah Motion is being sponsored by Barbara and Aubrey Abrams, Ilana and Michael Katz, Ilana and Brian Katz. That's actually my in-laws and my aunts and uncles, and sponsoring in memory of my wife's grandfather's yahrzeit, which is Bo Bayom. Today, his 19th yahrzeit, Yoshua Nachman and Chaim Yitzchak HaKohen, and the Neshama should have an aliyah, and we should have a happy occasions to come together and celebrate. Vakasha, Rabbi Adam, Toronto Eruv, here we come.
Here we go. Thank you, Rabbi Jay. Enjoy Boca Raton. Toronto.
Miami, Miami, but okay.
Oh, Miami, excuse me.
It's close by.
Toronto, 1921. The first thing I want to say is that the difference between 1921 and the St. Louis Eruv in 1896 is the difference of a generation. That's a huge generation in the history of American Orthodoxy. The generation of 1896 is the generation of people who moved, immigrants who came here to the United States. It's interesting that they got all the way to St. Louis by 1896, but it was immigrants. It was the immigrant generation. 1921 is the second generation. It's the children of immigrants. Sure, people came between 1903 Kishinev and the First World War and until 1924, but largely 1921 represents the second generation. And what we find in the move from the first generation to the second generation was an Americanization of American Orthodoxy. Americanization means that the immigrant generation, they looked Eastern European, they spoke Yiddish. It was very, very difficult for them to actually assimilate. Their children went to public school. Their children were educated. Their children had jobs. Their children worked in an America where there was a 6-day work week. And therefore, we're talking about a different generation. Orthodoxy struggled in the second generation. Orthodox rabbis had a hard time getting people to shul, getting people to be religious. And that's what the Toronto Eruv is really all about. First of all, just to distinguish for 1 minute between Canada and the United States. In the 1870s, there were already 250,000 Jews in the United States. By the early 1900s, there were close to 2 million Jews in the United States. In Canada, 1901, there were only, Canada in the 1890s, let's say, there were only several thousand Jews in Canada. So you're talking about 2 million Jews in the United States and several thousand Jews in Canada. Largely, the immigration took place to the United States and not to Canada. It's interesting that my great-grandparents actually went from Galicia to Quebec City. My grandmother was brought up in Quebec City, and they came in around 1895. So I personally have a connection to Canada all the way back, but there wasn't such a strong community. But by 1911, there were 18,000 Jews in Toronto. That is a significant community. 18,000 Jews in Toronto by 1911. And they lived in something called the Ward, which was traditionally referred to as the Jewish ghetto. And let me just show this to you. We have an old map. Here, the ward. It's mostly between Young and University, downtown. This is where the Jews lived, in this small area. And it was crowded, but it was very, very Jewish. The Jews, not unlike the United States, were mostly in the shmata business, in the clothing business. Now, what did Judaism look like? What did Orthodoxy look like? The first rabbi came to Toronto in 1904. That means there are 20,000 Jews already, and they only then get a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Jacob Gordon. Not unlike many other cities, he came as a meshulach. He came as someone who was collecting money for a yeshiva in Lithuania. They liked him, and they kept him as the rabbi. He became the rabbi of 6 Lithuanian shuls in Toronto. That's going to be important. It was true in New York, but it's even more true out of town, that the groups stayed with their Landsmannschaft. They stayed with their communities. And therefore, there was a shul of the people who came from Vilna and a shul of the people who came from Warsaw. We'll see that that's going to be important too. So he was the rabbi of 6 Lithuanian shuls. Since everybody lived in that very small ward that I showed you a minute ago, you can imagine that he went from shul to shul. I don't know if he went to shul from shul every single Shabbos, but he went shul to shul. Eventually, the Polish Jews wanted their own rabbi. They weren't satisfied with having just a Lithuanian rabbi. So in 1920, they invited Rabbi Yehuda Leib Graubart to be their rabbi. He was born in 1862. His father was a Gera Chassid. He was a rabbi in Staszów, Poland for 25 years. That, we'll see in a minute, is the reason that he got the invitation. There were a group of Staszów Jews in Toronto, and they knew of their rabbi, and they figured this was a good connection, and they invited him. But he also had some experience that made him what they thought was right for the community in Toronto. He had established community boards throughout Poland to strengthen Jewish education and observance. So they thought this is the perfect person to come to Toronto to strengthen Jewish education and observance. During World War I, he was arrested on spying charges. And he was, that's interesting. Okay, so that goes back to this. He moves to Moscow, and he becomes a spokesperson for religious Zionism. And from there, right, Moscow, interestingly, was not really a strong Jewish center at this point. He looks to come to the United States. He gets an invitation from the Polish Jews to come to Toronto. He comes to Toronto, and he's the rabbi of the Polish community in Toronto. Also, somewhere between 6 and 10 shuls. But when he comes to Toronto, he's met with the reality that Jews, basically Orthodox Jews, are not observing Shabbos properly. And in April 1922, just a couple of years after he arrives in Toronto, he publishes a letter in Yiddish and in English called a Shabbat letter. And he writes a letter to the community in the name of Shabbat. And this you have to see, because this is really amazing what he does. He sends this to the community. And he says like this: and the employer who goes to the synagogue on the Sabbath day is called up to the Torah. The reader recites in his honor, whomever violates the Sabbath shall be put to death. Kol mechalaleha mot yumat. He leaves the synagogue with a parting good Shabbos and immediately winds his way to the forbidden labor that had recently been denounced. Look at that, right? He goes to shul, he gets an aliyah, he gets the aliyah that says you're not allowed to do work on Shabbos. He says good Shabbos and he goes to work. And then he concludes and he says, furthermore, I appeal to all congregations to guard our honor and aid in eradicating this evil violation of the Sabbath. Let not those who employ Jews on the Sabbath day and those who keep their stores open on this day hold any public office. They must not be presidents or trustees, nor should they participate on any committees. Now, wow. There are a couple of super interesting things in this Shabbat letter. The first interesting thing is that he's talking to Jews who are basically observant Jews. He's talking to Jews who go to shul on Shabbos and then go to work after they finish shul. My father always told me, my father grew up in Flatbush. My grandfather was the rabbi of the Talmud Torah of Flatbush. And he told me that in the 1930s, that they had a hashkama minyan in the Talmud Torah of Flatbush. And the people used to come and you could hear their keys and their change jingling in their pockets because they wanted to come to shul, but they had to go to work. So they came to hashkama minyan and then they went to work. So here you go. It's not a story. Rabbi Graubart actually tells you that was what happened in Toronto. And he makes fun of them. How does he make fun of them? He makes fun of them. He says they were called to the Torah for the portion of the Torah that says you're not allowed to work on Shabbos, ironically, right? And then they say good Shabbos, and then they go to work. He says people had no shame, right? What he's really talking about is not only did they work on Shabbos, but they weren't embarrassed about working on Shabbos. They didn't sneak, out the back door and in the back door of their business. They went to shul, they went to work. That's just what people did. That was the second generation. Just to say something about that second generation. The second generation, you say, why did they just become conservative or reform? So the answer is there was reform in America at that point. Conservative was just starting, but there was reform. But you don't understand. For these people, who were brought up by very traditional immigrant parents, the worst thing in the world would be to be not Orthodox. Not to be a Shabbos violator, but to be not Orthodox. Means even if you're going to work on Shabbos, but you have to remain Orthodox. That was kind of the compromise that they came up with. That's how they could face themselves and face their parents. They remained affiliated Orthodox, but they worked on Shabbos. 6-day workday, work week, they worked on Shabbos. That's number one, which is interesting. Number two is that Rabbi Graubart actually tries to do something about it. Remember, last week, the rabbi said, what am I going to do? Tell people not to carry their talis to shul? I'll just wait. I'll just get hoarse, right? I'll just lose my voice. It'll waste my time. Rabbi Graubart, it's probably just a personality thing. He wants to do something about it. He calls on the shuls not to allow these people to be shul presidents, not to allow these people to hold any kind of office in shul. That's interesting. He tries to do something about it. Now, obviously, you only have one side of this picture. We don't know the details, but I would imagine that, he was only mildly successful. Maybe in his shuls, they weren't elected as president or trustees or on committees. But, shuls did what they needed to do. This was the Orthodox community. They worked on Shabbos. I'll tell you, this isn't part of the letter, but I'll just tell you this is interesting. That Rabbi Graubart approached the officers of the Cloak Makers Union. And he tried to convince the union to allow the employers and the employees to make up the Saturday hours during the week. That's wow. Like, I mean, he wasn't successful, but that's still a wow, right? He actually went to the trouble of really trying to work it out, of making it possible for these people to observe the Shabbos. So what do you see from this Shabbat letter? What you see from this Shabbat letter is that Shabbos was his issue, right? Shabbos was his issue. He came to Toronto and he was going to address the Shabbos issue. And that led to a tshuva, to a responsum that he wrote just about the same time, 1921, 1922, on the Eruv. What we're going to see in a second is that the formulation of the response is itself very interesting. But I noticed a whole bunch of comments, so let me just take 1 second and let me just see what we have here. Chat. Okay. Conservative, even 1950, were fairly strict about Shabbat. They worked late on Friday and had an after Shabbat meal service. And what of those working on Shabbos about their contributions, money donations? Okay, very good. If you don't come in on Shabbos, don't come in on Monday. Obviously, they didn't do that. How many people who work for Goyim going to make a living? There still is a stasha for shul in Toronto and also Kibbutz Minsk and Beit Lita. Okay, how many people were in Toronto at that time? Oh, I don't know, 16,000. I don't know the answer. That's a good question. About the total population of Toronto. I mean, the Jews were just a very small piece of that population. Okay, so now what I want to read is the beginning of the responsum. And it really tells you something about what Rabbi Graubart, what he was thinking and what he was trying to accomplish. He says like this. I have been requested here in Toronto by many people who are also righteous people to find a way, to establish a way in which all the members of the city will be allowed to carry on the Sabbath. They say that I must find a way to remove the stumbling block. Now, there are two things in this little introduction. Number one is he says that he was approached by the religious people in the community to allow them to carry on Shabbos. That is a change from St. Louis. In St. Louis, if you remember, the Rabbi Rosenfeld, he initiated the building, the creation of the Eruv, in order to have some way in which the people who were violating Shabbos anyway would not be considered to be Shabbos violators. Rabbi Graubart has a whole different story. Rabbi Graubart says he's approached by the religious people who want an Eruv because they want to be able to carry on Shabbos. So when we trace this in the history of North American Jewry, 1921, Rabbi Graubart is the first instance that we have of an Eruv being requested by the community in order to allow the religious community to carry on Shabbos. You remember, in Eastern Europe, many of the small towns, the shtetl, had Eruvim. So they come to America and they want an Eruv. But that little paragraph said as well that he wanted to remove the stumbling block. Generally, a stumbling block is for people who are violating, so they're stumbling, and he wants to prevent the stumbling. So it seems to be that Rabbi Graubart has a dual purpose in building the Eruv. Number one is for the religious people to allow them to observe Shabbos, to enjoy Shabbos. And the second is for the people who are not observing Shabbos, that at least they won't carry. The psychology is so interesting. You know, Rabbi Rosenfeld in St. Louis writes that what he's trying to prevent is people from carrying their talis to shul on Shabbos. Meaning it's very much shul oriented. If I can get it so there's an Eruv, they won't be violating Shabbos, they're going to shul, everything's okay. Rabbi Graubart is doing something the opposite. Rabbi Graubart is saying, you're going to work. You're going to work. But let's say you violate 10 Shabbos prohibitions by going to work. But if I build an Eruv, you'll only violate 9 Shabbos prohibitions by going to work. That's a very interesting rabbinic kind of response to going to work on Shabbos. Now, we know that he didn't like people going to work on Shabbos. That we saw from his Shabbat letter. But what you see here is that he's trying to do whatever he can to make Shabbos better, even for the Shabbos violators. So that's it. 2 reasons to build the Eruv. Number 1, build it for the sake of the people who are observing Shabbos. Number 2, build it for the sake of the people who are violating Shabbos. Okay. Now, what does the Eruv look like? First of all, on 3 sides, just like in St. Louis, on 3 sides, there are rivers. So Toronto is surrounded, in the outskirts, but surrounded by the river on 3 sides. So the only problem was really in the north, where there was no river. On the 4th side, in the north, there were telephone poles. If you remember, in St. Louis, they were telegraph poles. By 1921, the telegraph poles are replaced by telephone poles. But it's the same thing. Poles with a wire on the top. He says that they create the Eruv boundary. Now, you would think that Rabbi Graubart, living in Toronto, having the precedent of a North American Eruv in St. Louis that dealt with exactly the same issue and resolved the issue using the telegraph poles then, you would think that Rabbi Graubart would refer to that Eruv in St. Louis and says, here, you see, I have a precedent. But interestingly, he does bring a precedent, but the precedent for Rabbi Graubart is not the St. Louis Eruv. The precedent for Rabbi Graubart is the Warsaw Eruv. He says that in Warsaw, at the beginning of the 20th century, they built an Eruv, and in Warsaw, they also had telegraph poles, and the telegraph/telephone poles in Warsaw, even though the wire went across the poles and there still was a piece of the pole above the wire, but there was a cross beam, and the wire was on top of the cross beam. And just like the rabbis in Warsaw said that the fact that the wire was on top of the crossbeam is good enough to make an Eruv. Yikes. Just like the crossbeam is good enough in Warsaw, so too the crossbeam is good enough in Toronto to allow the telephone poles to create an Eruv. The wire on top of the crossbeam creates an Eruv. Very good, all good. But that's really interesting. Whoa. Why does he quote Warsaw as a precedent and not quote St. Louis as a precedent? So what do you think, everybody? Why does he quote Warsaw as a precedent and not St. Louis? This is already the 3rd class, so I can open up for a second. Anybody have any thoughts? Why does he quote Warsaw as a precedent and not St. Louis as a precedent?
Because Warsaw was generally agreed and St. Louis was mired in controversy.
So Mr. Coburn says the following. Larry says like this. Warsaw was accepted by everybody, right? St. Louis, they had a fight about. What does he gain by quoting St. Louis? Because one rabbi approved of St. Louis and one rabbi disapproved of St. Louis. Warsaw, all the great rabbis, there were great rabbis in Warsaw, they accepted the Eruv. Very good. That's possibility number 1. Possibility number 2, Batya, you try to say something, but you were, but I didn't listen.
But acquainted with it.
Good. Okay. Number 2, he didn't know about St. Louis. For us, St. Louis is close by. right? I don't know, close by. But St. Louis, we would know what's going on in St. Louis. If I was interested in Eruv and there was an Eruv in St. Louis, and I would quote the Eruv in St. Louis. But he didn't necessarily know about the Eruv in St. Louis. And Batya, I'll make your point even stronger. And that is that nowhere in his responsum does he quote the book about the Eruv in St. Louis. Now, it might be that it's Larry's point. It might be that he doesn't quote the book either, Larry, because he just wants to steer clear of St. Louis. Because the minute that you mention St. Louis, you're just going to be mired in controversy. That's good. Any other thoughts? Any other possibilities?
St. Louis
Yes,
is not,
Asher Stein.
in spite of its name.
The shape of the poles, the way in which the wires were arranged might have been very different. He might have known very well about St. Louis.
Good. So he doesn't make that point. It could be that that's right, but he doesn't make that point.
Well,
Now,
he's talking about the crossing.
Good, except he doesn't make that point. There's someone put in the chat that there's a language issue. Larry, that's interesting. A language issue means the St. Louis. I don't know why this is happening again and again. But okay, for some reason that someone's hitting a share and I'm losing my screen. But anyway, it's possible that he didn't speak the language, St. Louis, but I don't think that's a problem because the rabbis in St. Louis spoke Yiddish too, and they wrote in Hebrew. So I don't know if that's really the reason. I would say
that in spite of its name, St. Louis is not a Kehila Kedosha, whereas Warsaw was a Kehila Kedosha.
Good. I mean, that's good. So that's taking Larry's point one step further. So Mr. Heppner says the following. He says that if I'm going to use a precedent, I might as well use a more accepted precedent. Not, Larry, only because in Warsaw there was no dispute and in St. Louis it was mired in dispute. That's one piece. But Warsaw is better because Warsaw is the old country. And they still believed in 1921 in Toronto that if they did it in the old country, then it's kosher. Right, Mr. Heppner? They did it in the old country, then it's a Kehila Kedosha. What they did in St. Louis, forget whether it's mired in dispute or not. What they did in St. Louis is St. Louis. That's the new Medina. That's the new community, the new world. Right? Who cares what they did in St. Louis? I want to give a real.
St. Louis doesn't make it Kehila Kedosha.
That's correct. So that point, I think. All three of the points are interesting. Larry's point that he wanted to avoid controversy. We're going to come back to that point. Batya's point. What was Batya? Your point was you made a good point, but I can't remember what it is anymore.
That
he didn't know about it. Right, sorry, that was a very good point, that he didn't know about it, and he didn't quote the Sefer. That's very good. And Mr. Heppner's point is that that he wanted to quote, what do you call a Kehila Kedosha? You quote the old country. That's where now, Warsaw was, Hadassah says, Warsaw was the largest city with an Eruv. That's correct. Now, if you want to know, I'll just tell you for 1 second. Warsaw was generally a Hasidic city, okay? It was in Poland, and there were many Hasidim. The Hasidim built the Eruv in Warsaw. Remember, Rabbi Graubart comes from Gera Hasidic lineage. He's the rabbi of the Polish community, as opposed to the rabbi of the Lithuanian community. So it makes sense that he's going to tell you what's going on in Warsaw and not what's going on in Vilna in Lithuania. So that makes your point even better. Batya, I think that strengthens your piece of the point, right? Not only does he not know about St. Louis, but this is Warsaw. This is home, okay? Now, that's the next piece. Now, if you remember, in St. Louis, he left it like that. The telegraph poles, the wire is on top of the pole or kind of on top of the pole. That's good enough. Rabbi Graubart says that he's actually going to do something one better. He's going to install small poles, at the foot of the telephone poles at the two ends of each street, right? So at each street, he puts a little pole, 40-inch pole, piece of wood probably, next to the telephone pole on the two ends of the street. And he does this on every street. Now, why does he do that? We still do it today, by the way. The reason he did that was because then the wire is on top of the pole. Now, it's not actually on top of the pole, but the Gemara says that if there's a pole which is at least 40 inches high, we can imagine the pole as if it goes up to heaven. And since it goes up to heaven, but it can't go up to heaven, Eric, because why? There's a wire there. When it hits the wire, it stops. That's exactly what I want. So the pole goes up to the wire's on top of the pole, everybody's happy. And Larry, to make your point stronger, he says that's what they did in Warsaw. Happens to be they didn't do it in St. Louis, right? And St. Louis was mired in controversy. They did it in Warsaw. Now, unfortunately, Rabbi Graubart doesn't tell me the thing that I'm most interested in knowing. Did he get permission from the government? Did he ask anybody's permission? You remember in St. Louis, he leased the city from the policeman. So the answer is he didn't get permission from anybody, right? He knew a policeman, a local policeman. He gave him some money or gave him a bottle of schnapps, and that was all he needed. But Rabbi Graubart is putting up poles. So, I mean, it sounds like he might need permission. No mention of that. Not only that, Rabbi Graubart does not talk about how he leased the city. In St. Louis, that's a huge issue, right? Who you can lease the city from? Can you lease it from the policeman? How does eminent domain work? What's the right of the policeman to enter a house? All of that kind of stuff. Rabbi Graubart does not address that issue at all. He gives us a little bit of a hint about why he doesn't address those issues. And this, Larry Coburn, is right to your point in the following. He says the following. After all this discussion, one can see clearly that regarding the Eruv, one does not have to turn to paths that are difficult or to rely on leniencies and get involved in differing opinions. All these rules and disagreements have been addressed in other cases and in the city of Warsaw, the great city to God, Mr. Hepner, the Kehila Kedosha, the great city to God. People are carried on Shabbos with the permission of the great rabbinic authorities of Israel. So there you have a few things. He says, Larry, exactly your point. I don't get involved in controversy, right? You don't need leniencies and you don't need controversy. That's really good, right? That's good, right? Bachi doesn't even mention St. Louis. It's only Warsaw. He's only interested in Warsaw. I don't want controversy. There was no controversy in Warsaw. The authorities all accepted, and everybody carried in the Eruv. Let me tell you what I think. It is impossible to build an Eruv without controversy. It's impossible because some of these things are complicated. Even in 2023, some of these things are complicated. So you can imagine in 1921, it was probably complicated to put up those poles at the end of the street. It might be, if I could conjecture a little bit, that he didn't get permission for those poles. Or the permission that he got was not 100% kosher, right? It wasn't 100% kosher. And therefore, he doesn't mention it, because to mention it would raise some kind of problem. And leasing the city, if he went to the mayor and he leased the city from the mayor, he would have written it. Because he would have been very proud. Look, I have a connection to the mayor. I leased the city from the mayor. The same way we'll see in the Manhattan area, they leased the city from Mayor Wagner, and they were very proud of themselves. But he obviously didn't do that. I don't know what he did, Batya, but I know he didn't do that. And what he did was probably controversial, but he doesn't want to be involved in controversy. Now, sometimes the way not to be involved in controversy is to not do something that is controversial. The other way not to be involved in controversy is to not tell anybody about the controversial thing that you did. Seems to be that Rabbi Graubart falls into the latter category. He probably did something in leasing the city that was controversial, but rather than address that issue, what he did was he didn't discuss it. Yeah, who ran Toronto? I mean, all that stuff is true. The key is it didn't make any difference. The rabbi from Shashav doesn't know how to work the political system. They just had no influence in terms of the political system. I mean, this is, for Rabbi Kelman's not on the line anymore, but this is a topic for a whole other topic. I'll just tell you in one sentence. It's a little bit of a parenthesis, but I'll tell you that in 1935, the rabbi in Atlanta, Rabbi Geffen, gave a hashgacha to Coca-Cola. It's one of the first, kosher certifications in American history. And it happened to be that a member of Rabbi Geffen's shul was the attorney for Coca-Cola. So he used the attorney, obviously he didn't speak any English, he used the attorney to get to Coca-Cola to find out what the secret recipe was so that he could give them kosher certification and to get them kosher for Pesach as well. So what do I tell you that story for? By 1935, they began to know how to work the system. Now, it doesn't mean that in 1921 he didn't know how to work the system. Maybe he worked the system, and maybe he wanted to keep it a secret because he knew how to work the system, but he didn't want to tell anybody he knew how to work the system. All that's possible. I'm just saying that he doesn't tell you how he leased the city, and he's very proud of the fact that there's no controversy. That is interesting. So, Larry Coburn, unlike St. Louis, the request is made by the people. Unlike St. Louis, there is no controversy. Interestingly, if you go through the Jewish press with a lowercase p, in Toronto, in the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, there is no mention of the Eruv. Rabbi Graubart is everywhere. Every lecture he gives is there in the Yiddish press. Everything is there. They know Rabbi Graubart very, very well. No mention of the Eruv. Maybe he didn't make a big deal of it. Maybe he announced it in his shul, but didn't make a very big deal of it. That's interesting. There's no announcement. That's part of it. When you announce the Eruv, someone is not going to like it. I don't know who that someone is, but I promise you, if you announce the Eruv, someone is not going to like it. It's better not to bring it up. So that's the way the Eruv worked in Toronto in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s. And then the Jewish community started moving north. Actually, the Jewish community in Toronto is a pretty easy community to trace the population growth because it literally just moved north. North. And it's still today moving north. In 1950, there was a rabbi in Toronto by the name of Rabbi Abraham Price. He was born in 1900 in Poland. So 1950, he's young, he's 50. Hasidic education. He's in Berlin, he's in Paris, and then he comes to Toronto in 1937. Okay, he comes in 1937. He dies in 1994, so he had a long life. Rabbi Price writes in an article in Hapardes. Hapardes is a rabbinic journal that's read by the Orthodox rabbis in North America. I have to tell you something about journals. We forgot about journals today because everything's online, so nobody bothers reading magazines or journals or even the newspaper. But in 1950, if you're a rabbi somewhere other than New York City, you feel kind of disengaged from the Orthodox rabbinic community. And the way they used to stay engaged was they used to read rabbinic journals. The rabbinic journals had halakhic articles. They also had advertisements. They had gossip, news. Well, we would say like mazel tovs. It was all there. Hapardes was the most popular rabbinic journal. So the fact that he wrote the article about the extension of the Eruv in Hapardes is in itself an evolution of the American Orthodox rabbinate and of the community. He wants to share it with other people. He's proud. He's a rabbinic scholar, and he wants to tell other people. In 1950, there are 66,000 Jews in Toronto. Okay, they moved north, and what Rabbi Price says is that because they moved north of the Eruv boundary on what they call Bloor Street, there were Orthodox Jews who were carrying on Shabbos, not because they were going to work, but because they carried when they lived downtown and they carried when they moved north, even though there was no Eruv. And therefore, he says there's a need to extend the Eruv. Now, you remember that the three sides of the Eruv, south, east, and west, are surrounded by the river. So that's no problem. The only problem is to extend the Eruv north. Now, the Rabbi Graubart's Eruv used a telephone pole. He still uses the telephone poles, but he makes it again one step better. He writes that he actually put up little 40-inch poles or little 40-inch pieces of wood at every telephone pole. But he lets us in on the secret that nobody let us in on yet. He says that he got permission from the government. He got permission from the authorities. Now, 1950 is a different world. We started last week in 1894, and now we're in 1950. We're in a different planet. But that's interesting. The first mention of permission to do something regarding the Eruv. That's what he does. No mention of how he leased the city. That's not talked about. But the polls, he does talk about. What's the problem that he deals with? When Rabbi Graubart built his Eruv in 1921, there were less than 600,000 people in Toronto. So the problem that you're not allowed to build an Eruv in a place where there are more than 600,000 people, that did not apply to Rabbi Graubart's Eruv. By 1950, there are 1.2 million people living in Toronto. How can you build an Eruv around a space that has 1.2 million people? So, Rabbi, here, interestingly, Rabbi Price uses an argument that was made by Rabbi Rosenfeld in St. Louis, but he doesn't reference him. Again, like Larry said, referencing St. Louis is trouble. Truth of the matter is, St. Louis was not the first Eruv that was built around an area that had more than 600,000 people. Odessa in 1901 already had a population that was bigger than 600,000 people. So this had already kind of been true and tested. And that is two points. Point number one is that people in cars and trolleys don't count. Okay, they create their own property, their own district. So it's only people walking on the street. There are never 600,000 people walking on the street at one time. But then he has another point. There's another opinion that a public space is created not by 600,000 people, but by a street that's 32 feet wide. That's not so big as streets and highways go. So here he says something that's very interesting. He says our streets are not like their streets. The whole point of a street is that it's public, that anybody can walk on the street. You can walk as you wish. You can go as you wish. That's not true anymore. There are street lights. right? There are walk signs, do not walk signs. There are rules on the street. By definition, it's not a Rishus Harabim if there are rules on the street. It's not a public space if the street is limited in some way by rules by the authorities. So he says it's not considered a public space because there are rules on the street. What's interesting is, of course, so number one, Rabbi Price addresses the fact that there are more than 600,000 people. And what he says is that number one is the people in trolleys and cars don't count. And our streets are different than their streets. That's also something that's interesting that we haven't seen before. Now, initially, Rabbi Price's Eruv is accepted. And here the acceptance is kind of, is important to mention because he wrote it in Apardes. So it's possible that a rabbi in Milwaukee or a rabbi in Brooklyn or a rabbi in Far Rockaway will write a letter to Apardes saying, hey, Rabbi Price, I read your article and I don't agree with you. But nobody did. Maybe it's out of respect to Rabbi Price. Maybe it's because they didn't know what Toronto looked like. I have no idea why. I'm just reporting the facts. The facts are that from 1950 until 1987, there was no opposition to the Eruv. 1950 to 1987. Now, to me, and I guess that just ages me, but to me, 1987 is yesterday, right? 1987, wow, we made it to 1987. That's nothing. What happens in 1987? In 1987, by 1987, the Toronto Orthodox community had within it a very ultra-Orthodox section. It doesn't mean that there wasn't a regular modern Orthodox community like there always was, but there was a very influential ultra-Orthodox section in Toronto. The people who are identified, okay, good, thank you very much. The people who are identified with that community were the Reichmans. The Reichmans were very wealthy, and they were funding this ultra-Orthodox community. And basically, when you're funding the ultra-Orthodox community, you feel as if you can kind of do whatever you want. They brought in a rabbi. His name was Rabbi Jacob Sofer. He is not in any way well known. I mean, maybe he was a rabbinic scholar, but he was not well known. And Rabbi Sofer wrote in 1987 that anyone who relies on Rabbi Price's Eruv is in violation of Shabbos. Okay? Rabbi Price is still alive. I mean, he's 87 years old, but he's alive. And Rabbi Price didn't take this sitting down. Rabbi Price wrote a 27-page typewritten response to this objection. He didn't publish it. We don't know why. Maybe Larry Kobrin is right. Toronto, they didn't like machlokas. They didn't like controversy. So even though there was controversy, he didn't want to be in the middle of the controversy. But I'm just going to read you one paragraph of what he wrote, and you'll get a sense of how he felt about this whole situation. He writes like this. Anyone with a brain in his head will realize that the Eruv that I have built in Toronto is ideal. With its 3 sides surrounded by water and the 4th side having a symbolic doorway that is better than any symbolic doorway I have seen anywhere in the world. Boom. Right? He doesn't exactly apologize for his Eruv. He says, take it. Right? What are you talking about? My Eruv is better than your Eruv, right? They don't have an Eruv. I just say you can't carry. So that's the story. That's what he writes. My Eruv is better than your Eruv. He doesn't publish it, but people had it, right? I was looking for it in the early 2000s. I found this typewritten article, right? People had this article. It seemed to have been circulated among his community. Now, what do the ultra-Orthodox rabbis do? So here you go. Now, Larry, we waited till 1987. The Eruv was put up in 1921. We waited 66 years. And finally, we have a fight. Okay, Baruch Hashem. Finally, we have a fight. Rabbi Kelman at the beginning said that the Toronto Eruv was mired in controversy. I thought that was funny. I didn't say anything then, but I thought that was funny because Rabbi Kelman grew up in Toronto, but he remembers 1987. Obviously, he doesn't remember 1921, right? For 66 years, there was no controversy. Then all of a sudden, there's a controversy. So what a ultra-Orthodox Jews who have financial backing, what do? So, within the ultra-Orthodox community, there's this idea of hierarchy. The best rabbi, right? The chief rabbi. I don't know if you know, but on Shushan Purim is the first anniversary of this rabbi from Bnei Brak, Rabbi Kanievsky, Chaim Kanievsky, right? He was number one. They called him Sar HaTorah, the officer of the Torah. He was the one you went to with your question. So in 1987, it wasn't Rabbi Kanievsky. It was someone by the name of Rabbi Elyashiv, who lived in Jerusalem. He was the number one honcho. So the rabbis from Toronto flew to Israel, right? I don't know why they couldn't have called him up on the telephone, but it's more dramatic to say they flew to Israel. They flew to Israel. They spoke to Rabbi Elyashiv, who of course had never been to Toronto. I guess he looked at some maps or he didn't look at maps. And Rabbi Elyashiv said was, if you want to make a good Eruv, you need walls and fences. None of this symbolic, the poles and wires. I want to tell you something, Eric Levine. It was 1987. For the past 1,400 years, they had built Eruvin with symbolic wires and poles. From the days of the courtyard in Roman Palestine, they had built Eruvin with poles and symbolic wires. But Rabbi Elyashiv in 1987 decided that Toronto has got to be better. Toronto needs walls and fences. Now, the funny thing is that what they do, they went back, and of course, the Reichmans had a connection to the railroad people, Canadian Pacific and Canadian National for the Torontonians on the call. And they were able to work out a deal with Canadian Pacific and Canadian National that when they built their fences around the railway tracks, the train tracks, because train tracks need fences to protect the tracks, make sure nobody goes on the tracks, that they built it in the way that those fences and walls would count as the Eruv boundary. You remember, 3 sides of Toronto, there's no problem. Everybody, even Rabbi Elyashiv, thinks that the river is a fine Eruv boundary. The only problem is the north. So on the north, they somehow have created fences. And look at the, if you go onto the Toronto Eruv website, you will see the following. The following. Look at this. The following are the boundaries of the Toronto Thornhill Eruv. This Eruv has been in place since December 1996. It was created under the guidance and supervision of the Vad HaRabbanim of Toronto. Halachic supervision has continued under the guidance of the Vad HaRabbanim, and more specifically under the auspices of the Kolel Avrechim of Toronto. The Eruv is constantly checked, updated, and fixed. The cost of the maintenance should be borne by all members of the Thornhill Toronto community. Now, that's just kind of sad. It's kind of sad because there were 75 years of Eruv history before we got to that little post on the website. And the reason that there's an Eruv today and the reason that they're able to be so strict about the Eruv and to use fences and walls and all that stuff is because Rabbi Graubart fought for the Eruv in 1920. And Rabbi Price fought for the Eruv in 1950. And now all they needed to do was to make a deal with the railway company. And all of a sudden they had their fences. So actually, if I had to write a letter, the people I would write a letter to were the people who control the Toronto Eruv website. That history button on the Toronto Eruv website, that could give more credit to those who came before. So what we saw here was, you see, first of all, St. Louis was just in the moment, 1894. The Eruv that is now in St. Louis has nothing to do with the Eruv from 1894. It's a different community, has nothing to do with it. We actually saw in Toronto an evolution. Again, it's related to the fact that the community moved north. So it was easy. The three sides were fine. They just had to make a new Eruv moving north. So we saw something that we have an Eruv that starts in 1921, an Eruv that is continued in 1950, and then a little bit of a fight in the 80s and 90s, and then the best Eruv possible by 1996. But what we see the opposite of St. Louis. And this was Larry Coburn's point at the beginning of the class. We see an Eruv that basically was put up with all intention of avoiding controversy. Now, whether, Larry, they knew about St. Louis and they were avoiding St. Louis, or they didn't know about St. Louis, we have no idea. But the point is that they didn't want controversy. We wanted Eruv that everybody's going to accept. They had a lot of trouble. They had people who were going to shul, then going to work. They had people who were carrying. They had a lot of issues. I didn't even talk about the kashrus issues. Kashrus issues in Toronto were terrible, right? They fought about kashrus all the time in Toronto. So they had a lot of issues to deal with. They didn't want the Eruv to be one of them. They wanted the Eruv to be accepted by everybody. That's really interesting. It's an interesting psychology. That was Rabbi Graubart's psychology. That was our Price's psychology. Even when he was attacked, his response was quiet. And I think that's something to keep in mind next week when we talk about the New York Eruv, the Manhattan Eruv, which really led to controversy. And before I wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom, I'm going to look at your chats because you have a whole bunch of them here. You have a whole bunch of them here. The St. Louis Eruv didn't happen. I don't know what that means. Daniel is the expert on St. Louis. I don't know what it means it didn't happen. He was a European. He looked to what he knew. Correct. Language issues. Warsaw was largest city. Was the Warsaw ever controversial? That's good. It was, I mean, there was opposition to it, but it wasn't really controversial, especially among the Hasidim. Good is right. Correct. I didn't get involved in all that. Toronto at the time was run by Orange men who were anti-anything not Protestant. Okay, crossbeam would be controversial today. The wire across the pole off to the side on the crossbeam. That is absolutely correct. Correct. MJ Franco, that is correct. They do not build Eruvin based on crossbeams anymore. Every Eruv in Manhattan, every pole has a little pole. You know, every telephone pole has a little pole, 40-inch pole on the side. So he figured it's better than nothing. Rabbi Geffen got a list of ingredients, not the recipe. That is correct. I wrote an article about it. You can look for it online. It's there. Ray Price's yeshiva was on college near Ossington. Okay, thank you very much, Lauren. You mentioned that in Toronto, the push for the Eruv was from the Jewish community, while in St. Louis, for the rabbi who started the Eruv. Could it be because the Jews who arrived in Toronto arrived with more traditional observance? Absolutely, that could be. And it's 20 years later. That's an important point, right? They're more educated. They're more committed, the people who were. What street is he using? He's using Wilson, and then it moved up past Wilson. How many people lived in Warsaw? 1921, 1985. Okay, I think Ray Kelman's father was a Talmud of Rabbi Price. Could be. That's very good. I didn't know that. There was a lot of anger by the normal observant Jews in Toronto at the Reichman rabbi. It was an insult to the community. Very good. Okay, thank you for all the Torontonians. I remember catching out the Eruv in Toronto when I left in 1967. The issue I call is the 401 bridge over Bathurst Street, but I may be wrong. You might be right. Rabbi Price deals with all the things. In Jerusalem, the 70s, many Haredim didn't recognize the Eruv. More those who lived north of 401, another Eruv was put up. That is all correct. But again, the north of the 401, but it's still just going north. It made it easier in terms of that. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a great week. I will see you all next week.
A Haredi Jerusalem rabbi, the chances of him approving was pretty much nil.
That's correct. Well, the Reichmans controlled the Haredi rabbis in Israel at that time, so it was political as well. For another time. Have a great week, everybody. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. What language were the opinions written in that you quoted?
Hebrew.